Hey, I want to welcome everybody to the Sacramental podcast, the Sacramental Charismatic podcast. My name is Luke Geraty. I'm a pastor theologian in Northern California, and today I am joined by my guest, Nate Brooks. Nate, good to see you.
Thanks for having me on, Luke.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So we, I guess we're Twitter friends. That's the best way to describe our relationship.
Right.
It's so weird. It's real. It's real world, folks. But you and I have had a lot of conversations about John Wimber, Vineyard Theology, and I think maybe just for our listeners who maybe haven't yet followed you on Twitter, they should. What's no?
I just don't say much, but yeah.
When you do say things, it's insightful though. So, curious, maybe just kind of for our listeners, what kind of is your background? I know you've been in the Vineyard at times, and you have invested a lot of time reading on Wimber, and you know quite a bit about Wimber's life. Share a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Just church background. I grew up in a guy named Francis Frangipane's church in Iowa, who was kind of a charismatic figure in the 80s and 90s, and so grew up very much in this charismatic world, you might say. Was kind of checked out for most of high school, just skating and playing hockey and stuff, but then went to Biola University for college and ended up attending the Anaheim Vineyard for about 6 years, and so was part of the ministry team there. Was heavily, that's still, I think college years are special if that's kind of where you find God anyway, but for me, that church and being a part of that community has become sort of to be honest with you, I struggle with wanting to go back to that time in life. And you can't ever go back, but the Vineyard and that church specifically has a very kind of special place in my heart, and really formed a lot of what the expression of my faith, the themes that I think are important, and so forth.
Great.
And now I live in Iowa City. I'm in was at a evangelical free church for a while that was cessationist, and learned a lot there too about some of my presuppositions about what cessationists are like were deconstructed there, because we're all a lot more the same than we are different.
Yeah. But
now we just recently started going to an Assemblies of God, so kind of been all over the place, but I would call, if there were a Vineyard around, I would definitely be checking it out.
Cool. What years were you at the Anaheim Vineyard?
Let's see, 2004 through 2009.
Okay.
Or maybe a little longer. Yeah. 2003, 2004 through 2009. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. But so you were an ice hockey player, just pausing for a minute. I played ice hockey my whole entire life as well. Yeah. So that's awesome. So Now we have another reason to communicate.
There you go.
Yeah, we'll change this whole podcast topic to why ice hockey is superior to all other sports.
The cool thing about playing, at least in Iowa, it wouldn't be in Minnesota, but the cool thing about playing hockey in Iowa is you're automatically the best hockey player at your school, because you're the only hockey player at your school. So.
Yeah, that was not true where I grew up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but yeah, that's funny. It's like when I came out to California in, I think around 2000, 99, 2000, 2001, I was living out here kind of the summers, and that was I played pickup hockey all the time with the men. And yeah, I was playing as a ringer for the San Francisco Police Department and the San Francisco Fire Department, their men's teams. And the caveat was I had to fall down every couple of times just to make it, that wasn't so obvious, because I was a college hockey player. That's funny. Man, so let's kind of jump into the reason why we're going to podcast today. So last Wednesday, I got back into the Wednesdays with Wimber thing, which I used to do, and then I took a hiatus because I'm lazy. My video was a response to a YouTube channel called Leaving the Message that has been putting out a lot of content about William Branham. And then it also released 2 videos on John Wimber. And, I watched both of them. I had a lot of people send me the first one, and I was like, oh man, this person, has misrepresented or misunderstood. I think it's possible at times people maybe haven't understood certain people that they're interacting with. And so, recorded a video response. And I think the next day he dropped part 2, which transitioned to kind of fleshing out. The first video was about how John Wimber was a theological mess, essentially. And then the second video was about John Wimber as the cult of personality. And so you and I have had some private conversations about just some of the misunderstanding / misreading, as well as I think the misrepresentation that the author of these videos has done. And so I thought, it'd be great to talk a little bit more in depth, because I think you and I probably would say probably the most, I guess the most concerning part of his videos has to do with his grasp and misrepresentation of John Wimber's theology of the kingdom. Is that fair?
If you want to take it in a theological direction, I think, that would be the main theological misunderstanding. I think John Collins, and I don't want to speak for him, would say that he definitely cares about theology, but that's not his main project. Is theologically, he would see himself more as a lay historian. And so his project is about tracing how ideas get passed down from one movement to another. Okay. But there's enough in the theological direction that I think we ought to talk about that, because, you can say you're not doing a theological critique, but if you're drifting into that area, it's good to clarify, what someone's actual views are. I think one of the points you made in your response video was really good, that, we need to say things in a way that the person we're talking about would say, yep, that's what I believe. And then you can critique it from there if you want to, but you need to accurately represent, who it is that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, because I think we in the church, we oftentimes think about lay theologians, or, we have, especially in the Vineyard, right? We've been so flattened down leadership, try to really empower the lay. Like, I even hate the distinction between laity and clergy. That's my Vineyard roots probably coming out. But that's an interesting idea, because I think that was one of the things that I don't consider myself a lay historian at all. I feel like, my academic background is I did do, one of my masters was a integrative theology, history / sociological, it was an interspersed studies type of thing. But so I feel like my history stuff is dangerous. Maybe is the best way to put it. I'm like, I don't know. My methodology on that is not as, but I even think that was what was kind of interesting too, because some of the history that he gathered seemed to be off a bit in just the retelling of Wimber's life. And maybe this is the drawback to being an untrained historian, would be just like skipping some pretty big historical events. And in defense of the author of those videos, actually, it is kind of frustrating, I think, somewhat to be interested in somebody but not have a lot of the content of their work yet out. And I know that there's a project, I think, being done right now to get some of the Wimber stuff out, but there's a whole bunch of letters that have come out or that have not come out, but the details of those letters have come out between C. Peter Wagner and John Wimber. And so we're kind of trying to parse together, all this information, which can be kind of challenging too. So I guess where would you want to start with if we're thinking about, reflecting on evaluating John Wimber and how we do that in I think a helpful way, learning from Wimber's positive contributions, but also, I think evaluating some of the mistakes that he made over the course of his really tremendous, he was a gift to the church. I do believe that, but not everything he did was perfect. That's just like me, just like you, I'm assuming. If we asked some of your family, maybe they would have really good details about your failures. I know mine would. Yeah. Yeah. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, no, that's, well, I'd like to start by just saying, I find, if we're going to zero in on Collins' videos, I just want to say beforehand that I find most of his work very helpful, especially the series he and Charles Paisley did on William Branham, some of the antecedents to William Branham and like John Alexander Dowie and people before that, and then down through the latter rain. Sorry if this is too much inside baseball, but they've done a very good historical series
Mm-hmm.
on some of the post World War II kind of revivalist figures, and
Yeah.
changed my mind on a lot of those guys. So I'm not coming from a really trying
Before you do that, how did they change your mind? Were you a latter rain advocate before, or
no,
maybe not as aware?
yeah, I would say I had a mildly negative view of latter rain, but also understood that part of my roots were from there.
Okay.
Just from being charismatic in general and growing up
Mm,
in charismatic culture in the 90s, I think there is a lot of, what you could call latter rain influence. Uh, and by that, I mean the assumption that we're on the cusp of an end time revival. That's
mm,
sort of, it's like, I'm not really sure where we get that from anymore. I'm just
yeah.
speaking for myself.
Yeah. Interesting.
That is, I think historically that comes from latter rain, the assumption that
Hmm.
the fivefold ministry is ecclesiology, how we build our kind of church government,
Hmm.
is apostles and prophets, and that comes out of latter rain. I don't think that was really viewed that way before that movement. That
Hmm.
this is like a basis for how to do ecclesiology. And so I had a mildly negative view of just like, yeah, that's kind of where I come from, but I think of things differently now. Um,
Mm,
their podcast, and I would say of some of the post World War II figures, I would have said 3 years ago, that I think I would have criticisms for them in terms of financial practices and some lifestyle issues, and just like, hey, these guys are kind of loose cannons. But I would say, like, can't deny the miracles that happened through their ministries. I would
mm,
have said that, and I think they've opened my eyes to. I'm not saying nothing happened through them. I mean, something probably did, but I think they've opened my eyes to just how, at sometimes fraudulent some of that was, and how the
hmm.
dynamics of, like, if the show must go on, so you got to make stuff happen, and how unhealthy that was. And so
Mm,
they kind of added a lot of color, especially to the figure of William Branham for me. To be honest, it was a bit of a relief to me, because the stories around a lot of those guys are so over the top that it's just like, how is that even, like, I'm not,
yeah.
nothing I do is ever going to be anything close to that. So
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a fascinating point because in my own history, grew up in the Vineyard for most of my life, and then attended. We were actually living in northern Wisconsin, kind of similar to you in the sense that there wasn't a vineyard remotely close to where we were living. So we were attending an Assembly of God church, which was really similar. It had a lot of similarities to the Vineyard, but there were a few things that were like, oh yeah, they're definitely into this capital P prophets. They'd have prophets come in, a little bit more, I would say, Pentecostal culture. In the
Mhm.
Vineyard, I think disparagingly, we would talk about it feeling like it's emotionally manipulative or kind of hyped up. But in
Mhm.
their defense, I think it's just part of the culture of those
Yeah.
churches. But my introduction to the latter rain movement was actually through the Quest for the Radical Middle, which was written by Bill Jackson, which is the history of the Vineyard. So my first impression of the latter rain movement was like, holy macaroni, these people are off their rockers. Like
Yeah.
I had never heard any of the end time revival type of stuff.
Mhm.
And then I spent some time though, kind of pretty influenced and at least hanging out around a lot of the IHOP folks. In
Yeah.
fact, my wife and I had gotten accepted into an internship there. We were in the process of moving to Kansas City, and while we went down there, um, I had I think a theological crisis about their theology, to be quite honest.
Good.
I had a couple meetings with different people, and I hadn't really, but the end time revival was like a really big feature of that. And it was interesting, like later on when I learned more about the Vineyard history, when I was a kid, that was a very prominent thing happening due to the influence of the Kansas City prophets. So I was in the Vineyard during that time, but I was a kid, and it never filtered down, So that's interesting because I know a lot of people who are influenced by IHOP, Bethel. There's a lot of people in our stream, the tradition of the charismatic movement, who probably that would be kind of like their default position.
Mhm.
would be this assumption that there's going to be this end time revival with prophets and apostles and a great awakening and all that type of stuff. So that is, I think, helpful, and that maybe helps me understand better why a lot of people have found this Leaving the Messages YouTube channel somewhat helpful, because I've actually only watched 2 full videos from his channel, the Wimber ones. I've kind of checked the other ones out, but I'm not a specialist on William Branham or any, I'm like, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, based off of his Wimber videos. I wouldn't trust anything he's doing here. So from your viewing, you found a lot of his work in regard to the latter rain movement, to the figures that were prominent in that, I guess, timepiece. He's actually done a really good job of exposing some of the major problems with their theology, but also the practices.
Yes, convinced me at least. I mean, I haven't verified any of their work on that side of things, but it seemed very well done. I mean, I think it comes out of his own, John Collins' own experience growing up in the Message, which was William Branham's kind of the group of churches that were devoted to William Branham in the wake of
Branhamites, essentially, right? Aren't they pejoratively referred to that way?
Right. So he knows what I mean. He grew up in it, as was his grandpa was very high up in the leadership of that group, and he's done an inordinate amount of research. He and Charles Paisley, and so you're dealing with, like, I don't know if there are leaps being made there or not, but they sure seem like they know what they're talking about on that side of things. They also do a really good job, I think, of, since a lot of this IHOP scandal has come out, and before that, but they're having guests on to kind of tell their stories. It's like an Our Stories series that I found very helpful, just hearing people who are coming out of hyper-charismatic churches that have been really hurt, or just telling their story of where they're at. So they have given voice, I think, to a lot of people who it's timely, given some of the stuff that's going on right now. And I really appreciate that they've done that. And so I would go pretty hard on some criticism of some of the Wimber stuff, mostly because that's part of, your and I's wheelhouse. Like, we know, the same way they kind of know William Branham, we're familiar enough with Wimber's life to know, like, that's not accurate. So that's, I'm going to say probably some critical things, but I just want to give an overall positive. I think it's a net positive, like what their project is doing.
Okay.
So that's my perspective.
So, yeah. So let's start. I think I'm probably less where you're at, just because of my only reaction are to the 2 Wimber videos. But but fair enough. But let's jump into the Wimber stuff. I guess so. I had said, earlier, that my premonition was that it seemed like his understanding of Wimber's theology of the kingdom was for me the most, like, oh man. I mean, it was almost like, dude, you have either not read any of Wimber's literature or have never listened to any of his, because I went back and listened to like 3 or 4 different talks that Wimber did on the kingdom. And I mean, every single one of them, he is so not kingdom now. It's almost like, I don't know how you would get that. But you also said that you felt like, since he's not claiming to be doing theological work, even though you and I would also say he is, by the very nature of what he's doing. What would you say is where is the areas that you felt like he misunderstood or is misrepresenting Wimber's theology / practices? Where would you jump in at?
Luke, is there any way for me to share my screen, or should I just verbally talk?
I think that's a great question.
Like, if I click on present.
Yeah, try that. we're learning. Podcast listeners, you're learning right now.
Sorry, with us. You can edit this if you want to.
Yeah, go for it. No, we're good.
Okay. So here's the article on John Wimber, and I'm not going to go like hard in the paint on all this stuff, but let's just take one sentence here. So, Kingdom Now Theology. So his ideas, Wimber's, I'm reading right here, particularly those rooted in Kingdom Now theology of others. And so that right there, I go, Kingdom Now Theology, where's he getting that from? Okay, click on citation 2. I'm going to go down to this article. He's linked by Alan Bean, Angels from Africa, if I just click on that and go through, this is actually a very good resource for an overview of the apostolic, New Apostolic Reformation. If I scroll down to Wimber, here's a heading, Kingdom Now Theology. Now, what this author says, I won't read through it, but I would just encourage anyone, my basic point that I'm going to be making is just click on Collins' citations and read his sources for yourself. They don't say what Collins is saying, they say.
Yeah.
So
Which is lay historian or professional theologian or church historian is not good, right? I mean, that's kind of a, yeah, don't do that.
Look, I'm not a theologian, I'm a finance guy, but I can tell this is not, there's a heading here that says Kingdom Now Theology, but if you read this, there's he outlines, here's Oscar Coleman, who outlined, early on the inaugurated eschatology position. We can talk about that in a sec. George Ladd, who is kind of one of the main theological influences on Wimber. So this is a pretty good resource. And look at this last line. The motto of the mid-century latter-rain movement had been Kingdom Now. That isn't what inaugurated eschatology was saying, but that's what the apostolic movement heard. So back to the article, I think Collins is overclaiming what Wimber's position in terms of what he means by kingdom. He's advocating that Wimber has more of a Kingdom Now position, and by Kingdom Now, it's like basically everyone ought to be healed, and there's a dominionist. What Wimber did led to some dominionist influences in the sense of like overly political, a militarized Christianity that's wanting to take over society. That is not the inaugurated eschatology position. That's very clear, like for anyone who wants to spend 10 minutes looking at it. And then if I just click on Kingdom Now, here's a hyperlink. So he's attributing to Wimber this view of the kingdom that's kind of dominionist. If I click on the hyperlink and I go to Kingdom Now, we have the 7 Mountain Mandate, which if you know anything about that, that's like a social agenda for bringing God's kingdom to society kind of thing. Things that Wimber totally did not believe in and totally, had a lot of critique about. And nevertheless, it's being attributed to him. So that's one citation. And I guess all I would say is for anyone who's watching that video or viewing the article, just follow the citations and see if they say what Collins is saying they say. They don't. I mean, he cited you as a source and misrepresented what you said.
Yeah, that was a bad one.
Right.
That was a bad one.
I'm not going to attribute any motive to that. I think he's probably sincere, but it's not careful work. It's not the same level as his stuff on Branham. And so I don't know what to attribute that to, but there are some basic mistakes being made. So, I
mean, I didn't look at every single one of those citations on that article. I did look at maybe 5 or 6, and I found, none of them were saying what he was saying they were saying, which then, I think we have to be careful to attribute motive because, you can't read someone's heart. At the same time, too, it seems like, 2 things, that he is convinced that Wimber held certain views, and he's doing his best to make those things to be true, even to the point of misrepresenting or ignoring. And then secondarily, like what I said on the Vineyard, the video I recorded, it is interesting with, if your only tool is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, seems to be true in the way that he's even interacting with historical facts concerning Wimber, because he's, again, no, Wimber was a Kingdom Now. And you and I both know extensively in all the literature, as well as any of Wimber's own teachings, he didn't hold to that view. So that's I think a big problem for sure.
Yeah. So 2 quick things. If I want to attribute motive, I could attribute positive motive in the sense of I think where Collins is coming from, and he could correct me, is he has his own experience of growing up in what he would call a cult. And I think his main motivation is to help other people kind of escape similar types of groups. And to the degree that that's the driving motivation, I would say keep doing what you're doing, but let's make sure that we're not misrepresenting people. Let's make sure that we don't have a preset. I think partly what's happening is there's a predetermined narrative in the mind, like a big puzzle piece that's the grand kind of New Apostolic Reformation lineage project. And John Wimber is the next puzzle piece. And there's already a predetermined view of how that puzzle piece looks and how it all fits. And then we're going to go cherry pick data to kind of fit into a predetermined view. And I would just say that's not how history's done.
Yeah, and it seems like if his project truly is to expose the NAR deficiencies, which I have been very vocal about, they're deficient. To me, it would be like it'd be A, more historically accurate, and then B, I think it would be more helpful to the project to actually utilize sources that were early on, speaking up against a lot of those NAR, foundational premises. And there's a Wimber article, which I feel like every single time I have a conversation about NAR, I'm always like, listen, Wimber wrote a article called The Fivefold Ministry. And in that article, he was directly responding to C. Peter Wagner and the New Apostolic Reformation that had been kind of bubbling up out of the latter rain influences and other influences as well. But like Wimber would be an advocate for these concerns, and should be someone I think we actually look to say, hey, this guy back in the 90s actually had a lot of wisdom. He because that's the thing about Wimber for me, is that he was ahead of his time in many different areas, and he saw the downstream effect, the negative impact that these ideas could have for the local church. And so, like, why not utilize him as a source to submit or to help solidify the concerns that you have, and to help free people from the grasp of these ideologies that are harmful for the church. So that's the baffling part.
Yeah. And so, and I think we have to keep in mind that at the time Wimber is going through, writing about all this, the New Apostolic Reformation is not a thing yet. It's kind of growing up around him. It's taking shape around him, partly through one of his good friends, C. Peter Wagner. And so there's disagreement there along the way, but we don't want to be, is it called anachronistic, where we're looking back on an earlier time and we have in mind a fully developed thing that didn't exist yet at the time. And so Wimber's kind of, for a time, I think he got, with the introduction of the Kansas City Prophets, he did get, if we're honest, he did get swept up for about, I think from 89 to 90 or 91. Into some of, the revival fervor, especially like the conferences they did in London and the UK. He was on board for a little bit, but we're talking about a 3-year window in someone's life. And then he pulled back, course corrected, wrote some very public things, said some very public things. I don't know what else he could have done.
I think that's very fair. That's where I think, as at some point in time, I want to do some work reflecting on, those things that Wimber acknowledged were also mistakes, and to kind of learn from them, because it is interesting how there was a season of time, and every person I know who was in the Vineyard back then all feel like the Vineyard got off course when we went down the prophetic, because it wasn't like we didn't have the gift of prophecy in the Vineyard before. In fact, that was a major feature of what the Vineyard was in the early 80s. But when he did embrace the Kansas City Prophets, it was definitely a distraction, according to everybody that I know that was involved. And he came out publicly and said that. But I think there were some things that we could acknowledge about his own personal life at that time, that because there were some experiences that happened that I could understand why he was like, oh my gosh, maybe these guys are the real deal. Maybe what they're saying is true, because I've listened to some of the sermons in that time where I'm like, I know Wimber prior to 1987 and Wimber after 1993 would not agree with anything Wimber is saying in this talk. Like So
But
that,
look, the idea that I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the
no, good.
idea that you're going to be that influential and visible of a leader and not make some mistakes is just unrealistic. You
Yeah.
know, like I would not want my life to be judged on some 3-year windows of it, you know?
Yeah.
And so you, you got to take if you're going to do a summary of someone's life, you got to take the whole thing, do an accurate summary, not just cherry pick some of the,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little more about Wimber's theology of the kingdom, just to flesh that out for maybe people who are listening, to this. So when we talk about inaugurated eschatology, you mentioned how I think we should talk about it starting with just kind of the development within evangelicalism is prior to, the 20th century. I think there were a variety of different ways that people thought about the kingdom. You had some traditions emphasizing the kingdom being a completely future thing. Then they had other people, other traditions that emphasized the kingdom and the church were synonymous concepts. And so so Oscar Coleman is one of the well-known New Testament theologians who kind of coined this idea of the inaugurated eschatology. But actually prior to him, I don't know if you've heard of Gerhard Voss. Gerhard Voss, actually born in the 1800s, he wrote a book on Paul's eschatology, and it is already not yet. It's now not yet. It's inaugurated eschatology through and through. And I remember when I read that, I read that after I'd read Ladd and Coleman. I was like, dude, this guy was saying all these things like way before those other guys. But so you have these seeds being planted in the 1900s about the idea of the kingdom being both inaugurated or having broken in to the reality of the world and the first coming of Jesus, but yet not being in its fullness and not yet being consummated. And so, like Wimber would talk about the kingdom's within us, but the kingdom's also not yet. It's definitely come, but yet it's also coming. And so, Ladd. George Eldon Ladd, a Fuller New Testament scholar, really did the most work within evangelicalism. And so at one time, his New Testament theology was probably one of the most well-read books in New Testament scholarship within seminary. And he was a person who really was influential for Wimber. And so Wimber, I think, in my understanding, when he read Ladd and really parsed out the kind of young budding view of the kingdom being now and not yet, he saw in that a framework that would connect signs and wonders, whether it's spiritual gifts, gracelets, as Wimber would use that term. He saw that as a key to understanding why those spiritual gifts are available and take place in the world that we live in. But then he also, I think probably because he had seen the mistakes of the Word of Faith movement, folks who would say that the only reason why those things don't happen is either because somebody has sin in their life or because they don't have enough faith. He saw that the key to the kingdom of God as being not yet consummated as also being part of the mystery as to why we don't always see healing or we don't always have these miraculous supernatural things take place. And that really was the foundation for like Wimber's whole entire approach to theology, to ministry, to church life. I mean, the now and the not yet. Like when I think about like Calvinism, as an example, Calvinism tends to, and I'm pretty influenced by a lot of Reformed theology, but Calvinism tends to center its theological self on the sovereignty of God. Arminians oftentimes build their theological case on the love of God and the free grace of God. Traditions have a tendency to build their theology around an idea. In my opinion, the Vineyard has always built its identity around the kingdom of the theology, and that kingdom theology was very much now and not yet. Yes. What do you think? Is that close to kind of how you understand it?
Absolutely, everything you just said, and I would just say that the source we just looked at from citation to Alan Bean's or Angels in Africa lays that out very clearly. So it's in Colin's own sources, and so, but yeah, the theology of the kingdom being now and not yet has become, I think, the dominant view on the more conservative side of things. and more than just conservative side of things, but like, these are just people that come to mind. And all I'm trying to do here is say this isn't like a niche charismatic.
Yeah, this is mainstream evangelicalism now.
And furthermore, you can't be a New Testament scholar and not deal with the subject of the kingdom.
No, it's true.
Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist New Testament scholar, would say, yes, the theme of the kingdom of God is central to the New Testament.
Yeah.
So sooner or later, we can talk about latter rain and all that, but sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with the New Testament.
Yeah.
So here are just some people that come to mind that have the inaugurated view, the already and not yet view. Oscar Coleman, Herman Ritterboss, George Ladd, Craig Keener, Nicholas Perrin, who was N.T. Wright's research assistant for a long time, PhD at Marquette, teaches at Wheaton. N.T. Wright, Gordon Fee, Michael Bird, Michael Gorman, Scott McKnight, Thomas Schreiner, who's a cessationist, D.A. Carson at Trinity. So this is bread and butter New Testament scholarship, the inaugurated view. This is the dominant view that, just if you're on the conservative side of things theologically, you're going to make sense of Jesus' kingdom ministry by saying, yes, there was something of the future state of affairs that broke into the present in the person and work of Jesus. To say that it's all future would mean that we have a problem, because that means Jesus said it's at hand, when really it was 2,000 years would go by and it's not.
Yeah.
You have a problem if there's not some already component to the kingdom. You also have a problem if it's all already. If it's all here now, we have a problem, because the kingdom has entered this age, this present evil age, without transforming it. We still have injustice. We still have sin. We still have things that go on. People still get sick and die. There's a big war. There's a large not yet component. And the way in my simple brain I've made sense of this is it's kind of like when you take your kids to Costco or somewhere and they're handing out free samples of, like, let's say there's a lady they have pizza on sale, and they're handing you right there in the store, they're handing you a sample of the pizza that you can, if you want it, you can buy it, take it home, cook it later, and have the whole thing. And that's kind of how the kingdom interacts with us now. We get little pieces of the future that break into the present, and they're signs of the future kingdom. They are ways of letting us know, if you like this, if you want more of it, here's where we're going. It's not the full thing, but it is the real thing.
That's the author of Hebrews. I believe it's Hebrews 6. I love how the author of Hebrews kind of coins it. It talks about tasting the powers of the age to come.
Right.
And so that's why, like, Ladd's book, The Presence of the Future, was his big magnum opus on kingdom theology. Even, I was thinking about how it's like super easy. And I've been guilty of this, of slam dunking on classic dispensationalism, which kind of did take that view that, like, Israel was offered the kingdom and now it's all future. So everything that has to do with the kingdom, that's for later. That's why they came up, they developed this cessationist approach. But I mean, even within the dispensational world, I mean, progressive dispensationalism, which is I'd say the majority view of dispensationalists now, they all have embraced some form of inaugurated eschatology, because again, it's I think, because the only other way is, the more progressive end of theology is like, well, Jesus and the Bible were just contradicting each other. Yeah, there's wrong. They're like, they thought it was this, it wasn't, and then that was kind of the way Voss and Coleman and Ladd, and then I think N.T. Wright's done a ton of work on this as well. Surprised by Hope is really kind of a fleshing out of this inaugurated eschatology perspective. See this tension where there are signs, or there's these inbreakings. I think Derek Morphew, a Vineyard theologian, has his book Breakthrough, and that's what he uses that language of inbreakings of the kingdom in Jesus inaugurated it. I think, the idea of like when Jesus launched his public ministry, it was him planting the flag in the ground saying, this is the inbreaking of the kingdom moment. This is D-Day. And then we have the promise of the culmination of the kingdom when it's consummated in its fullness. And the knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea, or all those different prophecies that Isaiah talks about where we beat our weapons into tools, So this is like part and parcel. What you're saying is it's not fringe within charismatic circles or vineyard circles. This is like mainstream conservative Christian theology, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not splitting hairs to say that there's an already and not yet component versus everything's now, including like political dominionism. Like there are major differences between those two views. And it's not just something in the charismatic world. Just as a sample, I'll read one quote from Nicholas Perrin's book, The Kingdom of God. Again, professor at Wheaton Bible College. He was N.T. Wright's research assistant, not a charismatic. That's my point. He has a whole chapter in here on signing the kingdom. That's the name of this chapter, chapter 8. So listen to this. According to the synoptic witness, if Jesus' preaching of the kingdom was an obvious sign of the kingdom's arrival, then this belonged right alongside these two complementary signs. He's talking about healing and exorcism. Healing and exorcism were not just a neat way for Jesus to say, now that I've got your attention with these cool tricks involving demons and disease, let me get to the point by proclaiming the kingdom. Healing and exorcism were as much a part of the kingdom message as the proclamation itself. That's an evangelical scholar talking. I won't, because for sake of time, but Michael Bird in his systematic theology makes some of the same types of comments.
Yeah.
The idea that kingdom message and Jesus, the way Jesus demonstrated that was healing and exorcism, that's like bread and butter New Testament scholarship.
Yeah.
And so I think Colin's video tries to connect it to latter rain, like as if to talk about kingdom in the context of signs and wonders or healing or anything to do with the supernatural, that's somehow latter rain. That's an inheritance from the latter rain. And I would just say, I'm joking. This is a total joke if John sees this, but a part of me is kind of waiting for the video to come out where it turns out like Jesus's kingdom message and ministry was, surprise, heavily influenced by William Branham, where it's like somehow there's a time machine involved and Jesus went back, it's sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with the New Testament is my point.
Yeah. So, I mean, and maybe that's just a good, maybe that's a good methodology concern is I think one of the reasons why I really did feel like when I did this program, this degree, it was an interdisciplinary degree. It was really helpful, I think, just to see the benefits that other disciplines and other social studies or I guess history, theology, philosophy, biblical studies, they're all kind of having conversation, and then pastoral ministry, pastoral theology. But it's like in order to do really good lay history, I think you have to do really good, or you should strive to do really good lay theology, then, so to speak, or lay biblical studies. And you don't have to read Greek or Hebrew to see some of these things, because they would help. I think they would help actually solidify the argument and the concern about the kingdom now, because that's the part that I think you and I are both saying. Kingdom now theology is bad. I think it's not biblically grounded. It's a very narrow and naive reading of Scripture and ignores way too much Scripture for me to ever be comfortable with. But it's also, I believe, pastorally cruel. It leads to very spiritually abusive practices, as well as it can really, I think it almost becomes like an atheist factory worldview, where people who are in that for a while, they're told one thing, and then after the things don't happen and their faith is constantly questioned and doubt begins to creep in, the next step is easily to abandon the faith and then become an atheist, because all that stuff was nonsense. There wasn't a framework, I guess. And that's the part maybe that's just it wasn't Wimber. It was the kingdom theology of the now and the not yet that for me grounded me to like understand why I'd seen like supernatural, miraculous things happen that were unexplainable. I was like, I have no idea. And that was definitely like, I don't know what to say other than God was with us. And then watching friends that I dearly loved. I mean, just recently, one of my best friends died of cancer after praying and after, all those type of things. It's like the Kingdom Theology is the only grounding I really feel like I have.
And I remember coming from more of the, I don't know if I'd call it hyper charismatic, but from more of a run of the mill charismatic church to encountering the Vineyard. I distinctly remember being 19 or 20 and going, I can do this. I don't know if I can do where I came from, where I feel like I'm pretending.
Mm-hmm.
But this I can do. Like here we can be honest. We can look for God to move. And I don't have to pretend that things are happening that aren't. Or, ironically, I experienced a lot more in the Vineyard Church than I ever did growing up, partly because the anxiety was taken away of having to make something happen. So, yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, I guess, are there any other areas of these videos? Because I mean, it's like, I think my video talked about the Kingdom Now Theology. You can't hold Wimber accountable for people that he was associated with, because I mean, he was friends with a lot of people that he didn't agree with. First of all, we can. I mean, I think he even at times played golf with John MacArthur, from what I understand.
Oh, come on, really?
It's like, yeah, I think, or at one time, there's folklore stories that I've heard, but it's funny. I this last weekend I think I told you I was going fishing. The John Wimber's grandson and great grandson and his son-in-law came up, and we went fishing together, and his grandson and I were just talking about what we both called the Vineyard folklore. It's like, I've heard all these things and I wonder if they're true, and so
right.
But you can't do that. And then the citation of sources. But are there any other things that you think about Wimbers or the way that Wimber's been portrayed that you feel like, hey, that's kind of not helpful either, because it just doesn't seem to do justice to the history or the reality?
Yeah, it's hard because some of these exist on a spectrum. I think, again, there are some legitimate criticisms you could make about Wimbers. Some things in Wimber's ministry, but I just think it's like way over. Everything that's done is overclaimed without a lot backing it. And so the four main things I would say are just kind of repeating it misrepresents Wimber's own views and where they come from. It's not latter rain, it's New Testament scholarship. We just went over that. Misrepresents the views of his own sources, you being one of them. Falsely attributes things to hypercharismatic Christianity to Wimber's influence. I think there are some things where he's, even if Wimber was okay, he's saying that, the downstream effects of his ministry were people kind of took things from Wimber and ran with them, and it became this whole other animal. And I would just say, maybe there's something there in the sense of he did platform some figures that turned out to later on be not so great, but they were there on their own without Wimber. Maybe we wouldn't have had as much have seen them as much, but I don't know that there's anything in like what Mike Bickle emphasized, for instance, that you could source in John Wimber. That's just my take. I don't like the dominant themes of IHOP were not the same as the dominant themes from the Vineyard or from Wimber. And just because there's been an association does not mean you can attribute, where things went in terms of how views on spiritual warfare would be a big one. Another big one, I think, was misrepresented. Views on like revival versus revivalism. Like, are we going to create this whole industry around the idea of revival? Wimber would not have been, he would not have been on board with that. And we know that because he made huge corrections, towards the end. So anyway, I think it tries to establish like a guilt by association that just isn't very well done, in my point. Not that there is no association, but you got to be careful with where you're sourcing some of this stuff. And then also, I think there's some, and maybe I'm just bristling a little bit, but there's some, especially in the second video, there are statements like that are just a little silly about some things being said about, quote unquote members of John Wimber's cult of personality trying to suppress critical information to avoid scrutiny. I would just ask, like, who's doing this and what are they trying to suppress?
I think I might be it. I'm just kidding. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe there are like a group of, just unhinged Hawaiian shirt wearing John Wimber devotees out there that can't handle any criticism about their patron saint. But I don't know any of these people. I suspect he's talking about people like you and I. And if you're going to handle criticism about content with essentially saying, well, that's because you're part of the cult of personality, that's just a non-starter. That's not a good way to deal with criticism towards content. No one's saying anything about motivation. But if this is going to be the way that disagreement is handled, it's kind of funny to be honest. I laugh a little bit about it, but it's just, it's not I'll just say it's not going to erase mistakes in the content. So that's all I would say. I don't know who who this cult of Wimber is,
Yeah, you could almost, it's interesting because using the same methodology or logic that he's done, you could say, your grandfather was a Branhamite who was connected to Branham. Therefore, because of the connection between you and them, we can't actually listen to anything you're saying because maybe you're actually a false flag. Maybe there's some type of a conspiracy to actually get more people interested in Branham, and you're going to eventually. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And we would both say that would be a completely unfair statement towards.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, exactly. If anything, I would think, we just overall, I mean, really, we need to weigh ideas based on the merits of their ideas and the historical. Because I think, what we're all doing to some degree is we are interpreting historical events, and we are trying to wrestle with, because when I look at Wimber's life, even the things that I think we could evaluate and critique and say as being a mistake, I also correspondingly can understand how he made those mistakes, because a lot of those jumps I think would have been very reasonable for a lot of people to be in the same situation to then, I think one example is a prophet telling him his son's going to become a Christian after his son had been not a Christian for a very long time, and then his son becomes a Christian. That would be like, especially with the emotional tie as a father, my kids coming to faith would be one of the most important things that I would, value. So, I mean, it's just, I think that those kind of things are like understandable. Wrong. I still disagree. We shouldn't have gone down that road. I'm thankful that Wimber acknowledged that later on, but at the same time too, I can understand it. At least I have a little bit of empathy for those situations. Not always. There's some of them I was like, yeah, that was just, maybe a little, that was a big mistake. that wasn't a way to treat people or things like that. But yeah. So, okay. Well, I think that's helpful. So I guess, I'd be kind of curious about just your, when you say, so the theology, you were going to Biola, you had to take some Bible classes. I've heard about that, at Biola, and, you found the theology that you were encountering at the Anaheim Vineyard as being like kind of enlightening and helpful to the way that you were kind of viewing the world, the church, etc. Was there anything else that during that time you felt like was helpful, that came as a direct influence from Wimber or from, Wimber's associates?
Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, basically the whole okay. So here's one of the main takeaways that I still take from my time in the Vineyard is, I call it a working relationship with the Holy Spirit. Where in prayer, when we're praying over someone, the Wimber's 5-step model, I think, is probably one of the greatest gifts to the church. If you're able to, there's that famous Vineyard phrase, it's more caught than taught. If you can hang around enough to learn how, with other people, how they're praying for people during ministry times, I think that's like a huge missing piece for the rest of the evangelical church. Because the posture that you take, where you're inviting the Spirit, you're expecting God to come and impact the person there, but you're not trying to make anything happen. You're laying back and waiting, and you're sensing God's presence come, learning to do that. And you do learn to partner with him. You don't learn to make him come, but you learn to partner with the Spirit. That can become like almost a lens for life right there. Where you learn lessons in praying for people that you can apply to almost everything, in the sense of, and maybe this is just where I come from in my, where we did try to make it happen growing up. And it was so refreshing to be able to just kind of lean back and let God do what he wanted to do, and feel like you're along for the ride for that. But I that really impacted me. And, it's been a while since I've been in a Vineyard context. I was praying. My wife is pregnant right now. She's having a little trouble sleeping. I was praying for her the other night, and I've been so kind of stressed and busy with other things that it dawned on me, like, I don't pray that way anymore. I'm doing the just kind of close your eyes, oh God, please help. And I felt while I was praying that, like, oh man, I've not lost something, but I need to get back to trying to sense what God is doing and moving off of that, rather than just kind of sending prayers up to the ceiling. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but my point, that's
totally
that I've had.
Yeah, you're talking about kind of a participatory relational prayer life and discipleship. And so that was something that you kind of gathered from the implications of what Wimber's influence and just hanging around other Vineyard people kind of embodied.
Yeah. Yes, just cool. The people that mentored me there, and there was a theological framework that made it make sense, but there was a tangible reality that you ran into, that it wasn't just ideas. It was like, whoa, something's here. And not in a spooky way, but just like, every evangelical friend that I brought from Biola to the Anaheim Vineyard, almost all of them said, I know this. When they would encounter the presence of God, they'd go, oh, this is, I know what this is. So it wasn't new or freaky. It was just turned up a little bit, and we had named it. We had language for it. We named it, and we had an understanding around it, rather than just, here's a sovereign moment that happened to me when I was 18 and never happened again. The Vineyard to the church, I think, is saying, no, like, God wants to partner with us, and that's a tangible reality. That's not just an idea. That's not just
That reminds me a bit. I've been rereading this book by Charles Kraft called Christianity Without Power. I don't know if you've seen this book, but so it's, subtitle, Your Worldview and Your Experience of the Supernatural. And I actually got this book because one of my favorite pneumatology is by Clark Pinnick, and Clark Pinnick wrote the foreword for this. So I was like, I gotta get that book. But he mentions Wimber a ton in this book. And I was just reading this morning, actually, as I was reading some of it. One of the things that he says about his interaction with Wimber is that he was a professor at Fuller Seminary, and then Wimber was teaching that class, and he attended, and he came from a conservative evangelical background, and he said that if the class had come with all the Pentecostal, culture and practices, and he was like, he probably would have been like totally unwilling to listen to any of it. But he said the way that he knew Wimber had a background similar to his, which was a conservative evangelical, open but probably cessationist. He started out as a cessationist for sure, but then open but cautious. Yeah. He said, basically Wimber's gift was putting language to a lot of the experiences in a biblical way. And then also he said that it was very interesting that he was so intent on having that class be a space for people to, clinic time, and we use that language in the Vineyard, but he was so intent on giving people a place to be able to practice and to take risks and to explore how God might be at work in that moment. And so that's kind of interesting you say that, because like that's how your Biola evangelical friends felt when they came. They're like, oh, this is just like, okay, I'm connecting these dots, right? Because I've already had these moments of God's presence in my life, which I think you hinted at earlier. Cessationists are not people who don't believe in miracles, right? They do believe in supernatural miracles, but they generally position those things they articulate it in a different way. But they also do acknowledge those sovereign spaces where God would be present in a unique way, as opposed to like your normal run-of-the-mill type of stuff. So yeah, that's fascinating, because that's exactly what Kraft's basically his testimony of how he became someone who was friendly with the charismatic world was all because of Wimber's influence of packaging, I guess, so to speak. And that probably is one of the things that would be an interesting thing for Collins to explore and to reflect on a bit, is if you're going to talk about the downstream effects of Wimber's legacy, I think it is fair to say Bill Johnson, Mike Bickle, a ton of different people have been significantly influenced by Wimber. I mean, I have heard Bill Johnson say and talk with adoration, not in an worship, but like just he was very grateful for the impact that Wimber made upon him, because when he went to a Wimber conference, he saw them doing the things that he believed in for all those years. However, I think the interesting. So Wimber packaged it in a way that was accessible, because that's always been my opinion about Wimber's legacy, is that he made things accessible for normal, everyday followers of Jesus to be like, hey, I can do this stuff too, apparently, because we can all participate in these things. However, the downside is that in making it accessible, people didn't seem to really grasp some of the underlying theological frameworks that he held that were very important for not becoming crazy.
Yes. I would say it a little differently, actually. I would say they understood Wimber and disagreed with him. That would be my...
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. No, I think that's true too.
Because Peter Wagner, smart guy, he disagreed with him. I think Wimber died. Here's my basic thesis. I think Wimber died and Wagner won the day as far as ideas.
Yeah. And so 100%.
And I just the reason I want to make that point is because, again, I don't think this is a spectrum, right? You could say, yes, Bill Johnson, Mike Bickle impacted by Wimber, but they have different ideas. And I think they know they do. I think they know they do.
No, I think you're right. I think let me further develop that thought. I think in the case of Mike Bickle, for sure, because, when you go back to the history of it, Wimber, I'm not going to get into the debate about how Toronto went down. I know there's about 5 different different stories that can be corroborated by different people, but at any point, Toronto is no longer in the Vineyard. Wimber has said, no, thank you. They are now on their own. Bickle, after that, he pulls his connection from the Vineyard. They're no longer the Kansas City Vineyard Church there, Metro. And so you have Bickle and Bill Johnson and C. Peter Wagner for sure had different theological views. They had different ways of viewing the Holy Spirit or doing ministry or prophets and apostles and the kingdom. I do think there are significant differences in their understanding of the kingdom. But I also want to say, I think in some ways, and I don't mean this as a mean thing, but I just don't think Bill Johnson is a theologically astute, reflective. I just don't think he does theology that way. Because I hear him talk about the kingdom, and sometimes I'm like, he just did a great job of summarizing inaugurated eschatology. He gives lip service toward this now and not yet. But fundamentally, in the practices and the way that he carries out ministry, I've also heard him say things like, well, we don't emphasize the not yet. And I'm like, well, that's weird. You just said that that's what the kingdom is. And then you're only going to emphasize the kingdom now. That seems to be, but I'm thinking more so along the lines of people. I've met a lot of people over the years who are heirs of Wimber in the sense of, Wimber to Bethel or Wimber to IHOP. And those guys, I mean, like when I was around the IHOP, I spent about 3 years hanging out in the IHOP world. And what I would hear, I mean, man, Bickle told hundreds of stories about John Wimber. And that's what was the part that I was like, I felt familiar with. I was like, oh, this is my guy. Like he's telling these stories about the guy who's probably been more influential in my life, living wise, than anybody. And so there was a familiarity to it, but it was interesting because the people in the IHOP world who I was hanging around, they all had this like admiration for Wimber, you know, like because they had only heard these power stories. And I guess that's what I mean by I think a lot of people just didn't like, it's like they'd never ever reflected on like, hey, you never went to the source, which is kind of what you and I are talking about Collins in a sense. You know, it's like, man, if you go to the source, you'll see why it could be argued that Wimber was one of the, if not the most influential charismatic Christian in the 80s, you know, by a long shot.
Yes. I think and maybe I'm just trying to head off one of what I perceive as Collins's main points, which is that the NAR as it exists today, Wimber is in part kind of a big fountainhead of that. And I guess there's probably a legitimate point to be made there in the sense of like, he did have a large impact. But I would just, you know, and maybe I'm trying to defend him too much. I don't know, but
no, I think you're right.
I would be careful to lay everything that happened in the NAR, every way they developed at John Wimber's door.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, that's why I think so maybe both of us can say this to John Collins in the event that he does watch this video. Because I think you've been very fair I mean, it sounds like you're his buddy. That's what it sounds like. I'm like,
I think he's a good guy.
Yeah, you made that clear, okay? Which is great. I'm an actual hockey player. I like to fight in Czech. So, no, I'm just kidding. But I think that Wimber's article, The Fivefold Ministry, you cannot do any engagement with the subject of the NAR with John Wimber without acknowledging that, because he fundamentally disagreed with every framework that is in existence in what Matthew Taylor's, Dr. Taylor, who I had on the podcast, his observations that Bethel's not NAR. He likes to, I think the way he might have been on the podcast, but it might have been later on. We were just chatting. He was talking about how he thinks there's the NAR, but then there's this broader umbrella of the global apostolic prophetic movement. Yeah. So I'm going to critique both the big umbrella and then the NAR. I think both of those groups, Wimber would say, no, thank you. There's too many problems here. And so I think you are right to say that. I guess maybe I was referring more to how there are a lot of people who I think they're just unaware of Wimbers, like because they've never ever like listened to him, you know, because he was, you know, I mean, those YouTube videos are from the 70s sometimes, and you're just like, I can't do it.
Yeah, right.
Now I can, but I remember when I was like a kid, you know, I'd listen to these tapes, and I was like, all right, so, well, man, I really appreciated your time on this podcast. Is there anything else you want to add that you think would be helpful for anybody thinking about Wimber and evaluating his legacy and videos?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, there's a lot of people. We're in a moment right now in charismatic Christianity where a lot is coming to the surface, and you know, everyone's on. Not to sound like a millennial, but everyone's on their own journey, and that's fine. Yeah. At the same time, you know, there are a lot of people questioning the foundations of charismatic Christianity, and I think that's a good thing to do. I think there's a lot positive happening right now in that direction, and especially as it concerns like sexual abuse and financial stuff and spiritual abuse. Like, I'm all on board with advocating for people who've been hurt. At the same time, there is a I'll just say it, like, I'll sound maybe too Sunday school here, but there's a real God who does real stuff among his real people, and let's not lose that. We may not understand it perfectly, we may not approach it perfectly, but there's something here that it's not all just ideas. There is a real working relationship with the Holy Spirit that can be healthy, that you can call it charismatic or don't. I don't even care. But this reality of the gifts of the Spirit being used in a healthy way, understanding the kingdom of God, it's changed my life, and for the better. And so till the day I die, I don't know what the word charismatic means. Maybe I would drop that label at some point, but whatever that is, I'm hanging on to it. And I would encourage other people to as well.
Awesome. Well, man, that's really good. It's very encouraging. Again, thanks for taking the time, man, to join me. And I just want to say to the listeners, thanks for listening. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any comments, questions, you can drop those in the comment section. We'll have I'm going to put some, there's a list of Wimber resources that you can purchase on Amazon. And if you do that, you can kind of learn more about John Wimber. I'd like to encourage you to leave a like and a subscribe and all those type of things that you're supposed to say as a social media person. But Nate, really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. And we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks for having me, Luke.